me, and it's lovely to see one or two that were the same people from yesterday. So I am going to screen share, but do feel free to use the chat throughout, and if you want to unmute to ask questions or share, I'd like it to be participatory because that will mimic the way that I work in real life, if anyone can remember what that used to be like. So I'll start with a little bit about me and my background. Sorry if this repeats for those who were here yesterday, but I deliver bespoke training courses on all sorts of things. Leadership, well-being, conflict management tends to be popular. And I work a lot with student unions in the HR sector because there's a constant influx of new students, new officers, graduate staff, volunteers, and people who need to be upskilled. And in my previous life, I was a primary school teacher as well. So I very much believe in using a mixture of coaching and learning through play. So I tend to do a lot of activity-based learning so that people can discover the gaps in their learning. They can explore in a safe environment before I then bring in theories and skill building. And I particularly think it's important to practice things. So quite often we can be involved in courses where you're talked at, you learn a thing in your head, but actually applying it in real life is very difficult. And that's something that's very problematic in the field of well-being, because I'm sure, as we know, well-being is something you really have to practice and do. It's not something that thinking about is enough. So that's all I'll say about me for now. We'll jump straight into well-being, and at the risk of getting you to participate too early, we'll see how we get on. I'd just really like you to drop in the chat some of the keywords that come to mind when you think of well-being, and they might be positives, they might be negatives. I know that in some circles, when I say well-being, the first thing that comes to mind is people sitting on yoga mats. You might be thinking of different campaigns, but I'd just like you to drop a couple of keywords in the chat to see what our gut reactions are. Or if you'd like to unmute, feel free to do that as well. So we're getting a few things in now. So self-care, the idea of looking after your whole self, being happy in aspects of your life. So some people are really defining it here. Self-love, self-care, and it's interesting that they're perhaps a bit different. Self-care is maybe more practical, whereas self-love is more, to do with your attitude to yourself, how you feel, having some headspace. Thanks, there's loads more coming in now. Looking after yourself. Keyword somebody's dropped in is essential, and I think that's really important that we're seeing, especially over lockdown, how essential this well-being stuff is. A few years ago it was a bonus, but now we know it's really important to always include it. I really like Mel's suggestion of balance. Definitely would agree that well-being is about balance between all the different areas of your life, and we've got one, coping techniques, which is really good. So I'll keep an eye on that in case more come through, but we've got a couple of snapshots there. And I like that we've just had one in to do with health, not just physical exercise, but health is about your whole body, your whole mind. Yeah, being well mentally and physically. So if we get into kind of the nitty-gritty definitions, Oxford English Dictionary says it's about being comfortable, healthy or happy, which a lot of you have touched on. And I've cheated a little bit here because this definition by the World Health Organization mixes up mental health and well-being. And what's interesting about this definition really is it talks about people realizing their own potential. If you're mentally healthy, you have the capacity to reach your potential, which isn't always the angle that we take. We've got that coping with normal stresses, which I think people mentioned in the chat, having coping techniques. And I particularly like this bit about being able to make a contribution to your community as a part of mental health and well-being. Because really, if we're depleted, if our well-being is low, it's really hard to be there for others, to fulfill our work roles and have that contribution with friends, family, the community. So we're seeing here, as Jess said, well-being is essential if we're going to play a vital role in all the different parts of society that are around us. So, I don't need to tell you how important it is. We'll crack on with what we do about it a little bit more. And if we're trying to decide what to do about well-being, we really need to understand what it looks like on a day-to-day basis. And so this is totally unscientific. It's just my own visual analogy that I've made to show that we can really experience well-being changing day to day. So we've got this graph where on the whole, we're at a particular level. That might be our general well-being, but some days we dip a little bit, some days we feel really happy. And there's this point in the graph where I've drawn it dipping quite far. And so there might be something serious that happens, or we get some bad news, or just biologically, we've not got those happy chemicals today, and we have some sort of crisis or setback. Now, I've used that interchangeably because it depends how much of a dip. It might be that, today I'm having a bit of a setback, I feel really rubbish, but I'll be fine again tomorrow. Or it might be that, there's been some sort of trauma, something very serious going on. So I'd like to introduce the word capacity, which is how much stress I can cope with before I have that crisis or setback. And I'm sure we can think, of analogies or examples of people in our lives, and perhaps even ourselves, where some people might have a crisis or a setback at what we consider to be a low-level issue. And that's because we've all got different capacity levels. And we might also see people who we think, wow, all this stuff has happened to them and they're still coping fine. They're doing all right with it. So everybody's capacities are different. And one thing that I don't think is talked about enough in the sphere of well-being is how we build everybody's general capacity so that they're more able to cope with stuff. One danger of that, though, as I told you that in my past life I was a teacher. And so there can be an attitude that, well, if we increase everybody's capacity, we don't need to worry about making their job less stressful. And that can actually in itself be a little bit disrespectful. So we need to increase capacity alongside other strategies. I now want to talk about the word resilience, which is how quickly you bounce back after that setback or crisis. So on the graph, this one rises relatively quickly. I've not put a time scale on this, but if somebody can feel okay the next day, the next week, maybe they're quite resilient. Whereas for some people, depending on the nature of that crisis or setback, maybe their graph stays low for a really long time. And so there's a challenge there of putting in strategies and support so that people can get back up after the crisis or setback. It's very different to just looking after people's general well-being. So really, if we want to have a robust approach to improving well-being in people, we've got to do 4 different things. We want to increase their well-being on a daily basis, give them lots of opportunities to be happy and healthy. So just as you were saying in the chat, finding balance, practicing self-care. We want to increase their individual capacity for stress so that they can cope with more difficult things without having a crisis or setback. We want to actually reduce the number of stresses that they're exposed to so that there's less chance of there being a problem. We don't want the world to be a stressful place for people. And within reason, we want to do that. If you asked students, how could we make your life less stressful? They might say, well, cancel all the exams. That would be great. But that's not realistic because it's a part of everyday life to need to do them. But perhaps we can change the way in which their timetable, the support that goes on along the way. So, we don't want people to be in a completely stress-free life because a little bit of stress and challenge is good for us, but we want to take away anything that's too burdensome. And the 4th thing is about increasing that resilience and the bounce back. Do feel free to drop questions or comments in the chat as we go, or unmute if you want to talk about anything that we cover. I'll shuffle on to the next bit. So the main question I want you to think about, and we don't have to answer this just now, but are we addressing all of these areas? So it might be that we go, right, let's have a mental health awareness week. And because it's mental health awareness, maybe you're focusing more on the resilience things of, okay, you've had a crisis, here's these helplines, or here's these support groups. It might be that when you tackle mental health and well-being, you go, right, let's have, you know, walking groups or positive journaling groups that meet up. So maybe that's about increasing well-being. If we really want to improve things for our students and staff, we want to be hitting as many of these 4 areas as possible. I want to show you a couple of quick examples. I'm not going to go through these in detail, but they're on the slides and they're so widely available on the internet. If you're wanting to improve general well-being, you can do things like let people be aware of different areas of well-being. People might not have thought about taking care of their spiritual self, about their physical body, about their sleep. So brainstorming different ways of looking after that day-to-day well-being can help people to action plan and make time to do those activities. Sometimes you might have more formal training or learning, especially if it's a more complex well-being technique. So it might be that you get your students and staff to notice an ongoing problem that's causing regular stress for them, and you have workshops that allow them to deal with that more specifically and learn a skill set and apply it. So that can help to increase their capacity to deal with that type of issue over time. This circles of control model, or circles of influence it's sometimes called, is really widely available on the internet. And this is about managing stresses by changing the way you think about them. So if you brainstorm all the things that are worrying you, concerning you at the moment, you can sort them out into those that, right, I have direct control over that thing, I've no control over the other, and okay, I can sort of influence that. So as an example, I personally have no control over COVID-19, but I can influence, you know, whether I'm going to get it or not by how much I wash my hands, whether I social distance. And so when we feel no control, that can be a little bit challenging for our well-being. We can get more stressed when we feel out of control. If I find a way psychologically to feel a little bit more in control or influencing, that stressor doesn't seem so bad. It feels a bit more manageable. And the other quick one to talk about is maybe support services, which can help with that resilience and bounce back. And this happens a lot around, you know, exam time. Are you struggling to study? Do you want to come and meet other people? Counselling services around particular issues, helplines. And this is about looking after people when they have had that setback so that they can get back on their feet with the social support network. So those are things that you probably have in place in a mixture of different ways. And I just wanted to highlight that they address different parts of well-being, those 4 different areas. And we may not always be consciously thinking about that. And you may find that in your context, you're putting on a lot of different well-being activities, but actually if they're all in the same area, you might be missing a group. So it might be that, okay, I'm doing loads of stuff to increase capacity, but I've not got as much stuff that helps people to be resilient when they have had a problem. So you can kind of look over your offerings and check that you've got that balance. So one thing I'd like you to have a think about and share in the chat or unmute is, can you think of any wellbeing solutions that have had a poor impact? And perhaps why? What was the issue? And I appreciate that's a big question and might take a while if people are typing. So I'll give you a little example again from my teacher days. I've seen a lot of, okay, you're very stressed, there's a lot of workplace pressure, you're working 70 hours a week, so let's have a staff meeting where everybody will just do half an hour of dance together. And that's really good for your physical well-being, fabulous, you know, we have that time to chill out. And the school might take an approach that, yeah, we fixed it because we did one thing for you. And so in that example, it had a positive impact for that half an hour, but a poor impact overall. So I can see a couple of ideas coming into the chat now. Thank you. So some wellbeing workshops make people feel inferior. I think that can be a real problem, especially if people tell you, you know, this is the one way to do it. Or, you know, if you share a coping mechanism such as, oh, you know, on a Friday night, I like a bottle of wine and a bath, and somebody patronizes you and says, oh, well, that's not very healthy for you, and you get that judgment, that can actually make things a lot worse for people. We've got, yeah, people just telling you to take more breaks can be very unhelpful. And I'm sure it comes from a place of care, but again, it's about that. If you know you've got a particular workload to meet and that's your stressor, somebody telling you to rest is not as effective as somebody actually dealing with the problem of changing your workload. So we've got some wellbeing solutions don't work because there's a lack of promotion or advertisement. Yeah, if especially within the student union context, if you've put a lot of effort into putting on workshops, support groups, information packs, but it doesn't actually reach the people who need it, that can be a problem. Really appreciate what Hen said there about everyone being different, so no one solution suits all. I think that's really, really key, is that whatever you provide, you have to make it very clear to everybody involved that this is a toolbox of options, and that, you know, you pick what tools are working for you. Experiment, see what you're enjoying, see what works best for your well-being, and then make a good habit out of it. So maybe that would address what Rachel shares about inconsistency. And then, thank you, Jackie. That's really interesting, that a wellbeing solution doesn't work if somebody doesn't believe in the process and brings the group down. So you can have people who turn up to a session deciding they're already not going to like it and say things like, oh, I've tried meditation before and it doesn't work for me. When actually there's, you know, 20 plus types of different meditation out there. And when people have that negative attitude, it's less likely to work because they're not giving it a full try. That's a really interesting point from Danielle about if attendance is mandatory, it can be a bit hit and miss. So on the one hand, you want to have your uptake, and by saying, let's have a mandatory session, you're more likely to get people involved, but because they've been forced to be there, it might go back to Jackie's comment, they might not believe in it, they might not give it a try. And so you have to make that difficult choice really when you're providing something. Is it more important to get everybody there, or is it important to get people there who are going to do it with the right mindset? And it might depend on what it is you're providing. Some things won't be as affected by a negative attitude as others. Whereas if something is a little bit more, you know, I'll stick with the meditation example. If one person's in a meditation session and they don't like it and they're making a lot of noise and complaining and huffing about, that's really going to bring down the mood of the whole group. Whereas if it's more like a conflict resolution session where everybody's learning theory, if one person's being difficult, it doesn't change the nature of the theory for people. So maybe it depends on the type of session as to whether you use mandatory registration to get people there. Thank you very much for sharing those things. I think we've highlighted quite a few different issues there. And I want to move on slightly to a different kind of issue, which is that lots of well-being solutions don't necessarily address that there's different types of behavior that need working on in different ways. So I'm going to try something a little bit different now. What I'm going to do is put in the chat the link for a Jamboard. Now I know that not some people will be on this call just listening and won't necessarily want to take part, and that's absolutely fine. But for those of you who do want to play along, I will put this link here and I will screen share it as well, so that if you're not participating, you can just see what the rest of us are doing. There we go. Hopefully that's fine. I can see a couple of you are there already. So I've picked out a couple of things that you might want to do to improve people's well-being. going for a daily walk, detoxing from alcohol, learning study skills, working through a past trauma, eating less sugary snacks. So there's a real range there. And what I'd like you to do is see if you can notice any patterns. Are there any ways in which you might like to group them? Because some of these do have things in common with each other. And I'm not going to tell you what just yet, but I'm going to allow you to explore. So you should be able to use the cursor mode on Jamboard to drag and drop them. If you're just watching and not participating, do feel free to drop suggestions in the chat. You might want to unmute to explain why you're putting things together, and do feel free to move them, you know, across the whole Jamboard. I've left you plenty of room there. Okay, I can see a couple of things coming together into piles. It'd be lovely to hear some of the reasoning for that. Now interestingly, there are 12 of these strategies, and now we seem to have 6 on one side and 6 on the other. So fabulous, thank you. Somebody's just put in the chat, some are asking you to stop doing something while others are asking you to do a positive solution. Oh yes, do feel free to use the sticky notes to add ideas. So I'm going to tell you that you are halfway there. Yes, one of the ways we can sort these is by stopping behaviours and starting behaviours. Within those piles of 6, you can also split them a little bit further. So we'll still keep them on either side of the board, those that we're stopping, those that we're starting, but there is another criterion that we can sort them by. And thank you, Danielle's added to the chat that yes, some of these behaviours cause harm, which is why we're trying to stop them, and some of them provide benefits. Lovely. So some of them are about working on, now you've put work on your hobby. It might be that they're hobby, but when we look at those well-being areas, some of these things are for pleasure to make you feel good. We've got a good suggestion in the chat there that some things you might be able to do by yourself and others you need guidance, which I think is getting very close to the point. Okay, so I think we're pretty much there. I am going to just sort out the last few and then see if you've got any comments on the way I've sorted them. So there we go. So now they're in piles of 3s. And that's kind of the final order. And this is my interpretation of it. And I'm going to go back to my PowerPoint now. So thank you very much for those of you that had a go at that. I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint to explain what was going on there. Okay. So there's one model of behavioural change that says we can sort things by whether we're preventing or creating behaviour, which you noticed pretty much straight away. And a little bit like what Ellie was saying in the chat, some of them are low effort, so you can probably just get on with them by yourself. They don't need that much willpower, whereas others are much higher effort. They require maybe the learning of a skill or a lot of support. And so we can use this to sort out across 4 categories: novice, expert, breaking a habit, breaking an addiction. And this is really important to bear in mind when we're offering wellbeing solutions for people, because if we know what type of behavior category that fits into, we can choose strategies that are appropriate for that. And as somebody said earlier, one of the worst things that you can do in terms of, you know, a poor well-being offer is to say there's only one way to do it, or to treat everything the same. But, you know, each of these needs a very different approach. So we're going to have a little look through all these examples and what might need to be different for those approaches. So novice behaviours are those positive, low effort ones. So maybe I want to start a gratitude journal, I'll go for a walk each day and call a friend. What's really important with these low effort behaviours is perhaps to start small. Even though they're low effort, they can be hard to get started with. And if you picture that classic New Year's Eve, I'm going to make a resolution that I'm going to eat more fruit, walk every day, start a journal. If people have got 10 different things, they are not going to do them. So starting small to make it manageable is really important for making sure you're actually going to stick with these novice behaviours. Making sure that it's fun and pleasurable. If anybody's ever had that experience of signing up to the gym and the first few times it was fun, but then it gets boring and becomes an effort, you're going to drop off and not do it. So is there a way that you can psychologically reward yourself or find a way to make it fun? Lots of people do things like walking with others because that makes it a more enjoyable process. Routines are really important because these low effort activities are much easier to do when they're automated. So for example, it might be, I mean, I actually do a gratitude journal and have done for the last 8 years. And I always do it for the last 5 minutes before bed. And it's just a couple of quick bullet points about what's gone well that day. Because I've got a specific time and because the journal is on my bedside table, that routine is really easy and set for me. It doesn't feel like an effort to do it because it's all there ready. I've put monitor progress, and I guess what I mean by that is for some people, they might like ticking off that they've done it. So if you'd said, right, I'm going to eat, 10 pieces of fruit a day, or it used to be 5 a day, but now we're up to 10 as the recommendation. You might have a little list on your fridge that every time you have a portion, you tick one off. And so you can create a little bit of self-competition and challenge. And some people can find that motivating, but if it's not motivating for you, then don't worry about it. The final point I've put on there is find your minimum. And I guess what I mean by that is whenever you decide what this positive behavior is, what's the least amount you want to do each day or week? So it might be, I'd love to walk every day, but I at least want to do it twice a week. So that if you are perhaps going to miss it, you still know what it is you want to achieve to keep that routine going. So for a lot of these, they're not difficult, but they just require strategies that create motivation and make it as easy as possible to happen. Does anyone want to ask anything about the novice behaviours or make any comments? Do feel free to drop things in the chat or to unmute. And although we're not necessarily doing it in this session, this may be a time for you to think about any well-being strategies and behaviours you've been struggling with. And you might notice that, okay, I've been finding it hard to do that. So I might try and make it more fun, or I might try and put a routine in. So you might be thinking about this for your staff and students, but do also apply it to yourself as well. Okay, I've not seen anything come in on the chat, so I'll move on, but if we get anything, I'll come back to it. So then we had the more expert behaviours. So learning study skills, learning about conflict resolution, working through a past trauma, they're high effort. It requires me to do something new that takes time, energy, persistence, and willpower. So we're already getting a different feel from these compared to the novice behaviours. The practice has to be focused. You can pretty much go for a walk or eat a piece of fruit mindlessly, but you can't learn to study mindlessly. You have to really concentrate on it, and you might need some formal input, whether that's an actual teacher or instructional videos or, reading theoretical books. there's a more concrete process to the learning. I've put on here about having sub goals or milestones, because for some of these, if you're, eating a piece of fruit each day, it's either done or not done. But if you're learning to resolve conflict better, there is no end point where, right, I've finished now, I'm good at that. You have a process of learning, and that can be really difficult for motivation. So you might want to look back and say, right, I've been practicing it for this many weeks, I'm really proud. Or in terms of study skills, it might be that normally after half an hour of study, I feel confused and tired, but now I can go for an hour and I feel okay. So working out whatever milestones make sense to you so that you're encouraged and motivated by the progress that you've made along the way. I've put deadline in there. It might not work for these well-being examples. I also talk about this in the context of learning. So learning the guitar is an expert behavior. And a lot of people don't get round to doing things like that because there's never any reason to. Oh, I want to do it for fun, but I've got no exam, there's no deadline. And so saying to yourself, right, I want to learn the guitar before my mum's birthday because I'm going to play her a song. Or I want to learn Spanish before my next holiday. That deadline gives you a little bit of accountability. Might not be realistic with some of these. I guess study skills you might want to learn before the exam period. You might want to learn in your first year. It might be that I want to learn some conflict resolution skills before the next Christmas family dinner, because that tends to be a high touch point. So sometimes that can, again, provide a little bit more motivation for you. And along the way, because these take a lot of effort, you have to really persist and reflect on the progress that you're making along the way. So you can see that these require a lot more long-term commitment and support. And so treating them in the same way as, the walk, the fruit, the calling a friend is not appropriate. I can't see any comments or questions on these ones. We'll start moving over to the preventing behaviours. So both of the prevention ones are harder than starting a behaviour, and I'll talk more about why later when I say a little bit about the brain. But if we think about habits like biting our fingernails, eating snacks, scrolling, there's an underlying need there, and there's an underlying routine already established. And so sometimes you have to distract yourself from that. So, okay, when I'm about to have a snack, maybe I'll just send one more email or walk into a different room to see if I actually need to do that thing. Replacing it with something else. So I found that when I wanted to do healthier eating, I swapped my lunchtime unhealthy snack for a piece of fruit. And then because I was still having something sweet, but something healthier, an orange is healthier than a bit chocolate biscuit, that replacement was helpful. I put planned obstacles, and what I mean by that is make it difficult to do the habit that you're trying to stop. So if I've got a packet of biscuits on my desk right next to me, I'm probably going to eat those biscuits. But if they are in a tin, in the cupboard, in the kitchen, I'm less likely to do it because it takes more energy. So I've got more chances along the way to decide, actually, I don't want to do this thing. So for a lot of people, if you're scrolling on social media a lot at night time, switch your phone off, put it in a different room, because then you're less likely to just pick it up. If something's easy to do, you're more likely to go back into that habit. Some things you might just moderate them. So, okay, I'm going to watch 2 episodes of this on Netflix, and then I'll set it automatically to switch off. So you're not saying we're going to stop this thing altogether, but we're just going to do it in a smaller amount. Delaying gratification is very interesting, because sometimes you can say, oh, I really fancy that chocolate biscuit. I'm just going to wait 10 minutes. And maybe in 10 minutes time, you don't fancy it anymore. And so you've rode the urge is gone. Or it might be that after 10 minutes, you think, you know what, I still do want that biscuit and I'm just going to go for it. So there's an element of self-care in doing this as well. Remind yourself why you've set up this challenge. You know, if you said you want to stop doing this, there'll be a reason. And maybe it's to do with your identity, that I really want to be a healthier person, and so this goal is important to me. And that can be quite a motivating thing to remind yourself of if you're trying to break that habit. Any questions or thoughts on these habit behaviours? Okay, I shall move on to the next one. So the very last one is breaking addictive behaviours. And I will just say that for a lot of these, they will require some professional help. It's not something that people can very easily do on their own. And for some things, like if you are an alcoholic, giving up alcohol, the detox process can be quite damaging on the body. And so you need support services to be able to mediate that. So I'm sure, you know, every student union has these signposting services for things that are a little bit more challenging. For some people, they can just reduce the addictive behaviour. So smoking is a classic example where people smoke less before they stop altogether. But for some things, that's not appropriate. You know, an alcoholic finds it very difficult just to drink a little bit, and so a full detox is needed. In some cases, you might replace one thing with another. So with smoking, it gets replaced with vaping. So you still have some of the chemicals the same, but others are different. But really what's going on here, and I guess this links back to that resilience bit, is there's a reason why somebody's engaged in these behaviours to begin with. And it's normally a way of coping with stress or escaping or forgetting, or it might be that they get that rush of neurotransmitters. So we have serotonin and dopamine, all these things that make us feel positive. I think it's dopamine for addicting behaviours. And we need to find what those triggers are, what those causes are, and find a different way of approaching them. And people who are trying to get rid of an addictive behaviour need an awful lot of social support to be able to do so successfully, because they will have setbacks. And I guess earlier somebody said in the chat, a wellbeing strategy doesn't work when people are made to feel inferior. And I think there's a lot of stigma around these addictive behaviours. But if you're trying to do something as high effort as give up an addiction, coping with the stress of that stigma will just make it even more difficult. So these are the 4 areas. This is the most challenging one. And I think that really, if you're looking within your organisation, this isn't the breaking addictive behaviours isn't something you'll personally be handling, but you will need to know where to signpost people to get this done well. I want to move on a little bit and talk about what's going on in the brain. So for those who might not be aware, our brain's a big ball of wires called neurons. They're all connected in lots of interesting and fascinating ways that I could talk about for far too long. But in its most basic sense, what we have on the right is the individual neuron. And when you're behaving, it sends a message down the neuron to the end, and it passes it on. And the more often you repeat a behavior, the easier it is for that neuron to fire. So day one, when you do something, you know, okay, I'm going to go to the gym on day one, it takes an awful lot of electrical energy, neurotransmitters and all that stuff. I'm oversimplifying, but all the stuff that's going on in the brain, it takes high energy. But then once you've done it 3, 4, 10, 30 times, that neuron's really used to it now and it's low effort. And so a lot of what's going on when we're talking about well-being and resilience is about building these neuronal pathways in the brain. An easier analogy is on the left-hand side, we have a field of long grass. The first time you walk through that field, it's maybe an effort pushing everything aside, you get prickled by things. The second time you walk through, you know, the grass has bounced back up again. But maybe by the 100th time, you have what's going on here on the right, which is now you've got a dirt path. And now it's really clear. You can get down it much faster, much easier without getting prickled along the way. So when we're creating a positive behaviour, we want those routines, we want those habits so that that path is really easy to walk. On the flip side, if we're trying to break a habit or break an addiction, I'm standing on a road where there's a dirt path and you're asking me to ignore the path and walk through the grass. That's really hard work. If there's an easy option that my brain is used to, that I've walked this path before and it's comfortable and it's safe, when you're asking me to do something new and give up that habit, that addiction, it's a real challenge. And so whoever's developing and delivering any well-being strategies really needs to have an awareness that this is what's going on subconsciously for a lot of people. They might not explain it out loud, but when you have that participant in the room that says, oh, I tried meditation, it didn't work, or, you know, this is rubbish, what's probably happening is that they've got their well-worn path that they're really comfortable with. And by asking them to change, it's creating personal discomfort that's manifesting in challenging behavior. And so we have to be prepared to deal with that whilst being really positive about the benefits of creating those routines. So to kind of summarize the things that we've been doing here, we really want to make sure if we're having a lasting change on people that we look at all 4 areas. And it might not be that all 4 areas are included in the same course, but as a student union, as a body, you want to be making sure that you're addressing all those things at some point so that people can access what it is they need. And that as part of that, you're thinking about the underlying psychology of what you're offering. If you're just wanting to increase general well-being through exercise, yoga, arts and crafts, okay, they are novice behaviors, so we need reward systems, fun, routines. Whereas if you're increasing capacity for stress by learning something, okay, we might need a 6-week course where people are really learning something in depth and they get that chance to practice and grow. And so really understanding how your tools map to the psychology of their impact is going to help you to offer something much more robust to the people you're working with. Just for the last few minutes, anybody who wants to share in the chat or wants to unmute, I have a reflective question here of where can I improve my staff and students' well-being? You might be thinking about one of those 4 areas that need some work, or maybe you have a scheme already that's in place, but you want it to have a longer term impact. And then just while you're thinking about that, because we're very nearly at the end, I'll just put some of my details in the chat so that you have them before we go. So I've just put my contact page if anybody would like to join my mailing list. As I said, I deliver a lot of leadership, wellbeing, conflict resolution courses. My email address is in there. And this model of 4 types of behavioural change is also documented in one of the blogs on my website if you want to refer back to it. And over lockdown, I have been producing a series of daily wellbeing videos, which are just short activities people can try. And actually, I want to be a bit self-critical because I said earlier, what can be a problem, a low impact wellbeing activity is one where people do it once and they never bother again. So my intention with that series is that, yes, there's one activity a day, but people find the ones that work for them and they turn it into a regular habit or routine. So there's some resources there if that's helpful. I haven't seen any reflections appear in the chat just yet. Oh, I've got one come through as well. And do feel free to chuck in any questions also. If anyone finds it easier to just unmute, very happy to do that, but you might not want to given we're recorded. So we have a question. Resilience seems to be very individualized based on a person. What have been your experiences or recommendations on creating a successful resilience program for students? Lovely. Yes, definitely something worth acknowledging. And so I think whenever you're designing something resilience-based or any general well-being, you want to make sure that there's always room for discussion and people to tell you what works for them. So I said at the very beginning, I blend instructions with coaching, and coaching is a style of working and leadership where you ask people to reflect, you ask them what they need. So yes, present them with tools, present them with support networks, but also throughout that, continue to have spaces to ask them, how are you getting on with this? Which bits are working? Which bits are a challenge still? What else could we offer? And having that two-way communication makes it a little bit more accessible for people. We've got about 2 minutes left. So I'll just put the last slide on. Do feel free to ask some more questions. I hope that covers what you wanted, Runcie. I know that doesn't make it easy to saying, you know, make it bespoke, because you're actually working with, you know, a really large number of people. So it can be very difficult. But what might be helpful is to consult with people in advance, you know, use student surveys or consultation meetings to find out what people would find most useful. And create support communities. So I have seen some student unions over lockdown create Facebook groups or other areas where people can continually share what it is they're after, and also share tips with each other as well, which can be really helpful for that encouragement and motivation when it comes to wellbeing activities. Fabulous. So I think that might be it for questions. Thank you so much to everybody who's contributed in the chat and got involved. And I hope that that's been really useful for you personally, but also for your, you know, for your teams and students.
That was really interesting. Thank you so much for that presentation, Gemma. Do take a look at, do contact Gemma if you've got any questions about anything regarding building resilience and well-being. Gemma, thank you again. You've been an absolute star, coming in doing quite a lot of sessions this week. So thank you very much, and see you all at the next session.